I should have known something was wrong when Derek told the customs officer in Tokyo that I was just along for the ride and to direct all questions to him. But it wasn't until I stood in our empty penthouse in Seattle 6 months later, holding my grandmother's final letter in one hand and my first passport stamp in the other, that I realized my entire marriage had been one long, calculated effort to keep me small and dependent. Hold up. I'm curious where you're listening from, and if this story spoke to you, make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, what I have planned for tomorrow is going to blow you away. Now, as I write this from a rooftop cafe in Marrakech, my 23rd country this year, I can barely recognize the woman who once asked permission to visit the grocery store alone. The woman who believed a good wife's only ambition should be perfecting her husband's favorite meals and organizing his social calendar. The woman who almost ignored an inheritance that would transform everything. Before we dive deeper, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I'm revealing the shocking discovery that finally opened my eyes to who Derek really was. My name is Catalina Morales, though for 8 years, everyone called me Mrs. Derek Ashworth. At 34, I thought I was living a charmed existence, married to a successful tech entrepreneur, residing in a stunning glass penthouse overlooking Elliott Bay, with a gourmet kitchen that had been featured in Architectural Digest, and a social circle that envied our picture-perfect lifestyle. Derek and I met at Pike Place Market on a drizzly Saturday morning 4 years before my world completely shifted. I was there sourcing ingredients for Corazon, the small but acclaimed restaurant I co-owned with my best friend in Capitol Hill, known for our innovative fusion of Latin flavors with Pacific Northwest ingredients. He was there with his startup team from Nexus Technologies, celebrating their latest venture capital funding with a morning of artisanal coffee and fresh seafood. Our connection sparked over competing for the last pound of wild Alaskan salmon at Pure Food Fish Market. He was everything I wasn't: polished, tech-savvy, third-generation American with the effortless confidence that comes from inherited privilege. I was the daughter of Colombian immigrants who had worked 3 jobs to put me through culinary school while helping my parents establish their small grocery store in Georgetown. "You clearly know what you're doing with that fish," he said after witnessing my negotiation with the fishmonger, his green eyes sparkling with genuine interest. "Chef or just passionate home cook?" I laughed, tucking a strand of dark hair behind my ear. "Chef, actually. And you're obviously not from around here if you think that salmon is going to cook itself properly without the right technique." What followed was 2 hours of market wandering, him asking thoughtful questions about ingredient selection and cooking methods, while I explained the delicate balance of flavors that made my signature ceviches so popular with food critics. "You're extraordinary," he told me over our 3rd cup of coffee at the original Starbucks. "I've dated plenty of successful women, but I've never met someone who creates experiences the way you do. Every dish has a story, a purpose." Our courtship unfolded like a romantic movie: dinners at Seattle's most exclusive restaurants, weekend getaways to wine country and Walla Walla, his apparent fascination with my culinary creativity. Derek would spend entire evenings in my small apartment kitchen, watching me transform simple ingredients into complex flavor profiles, genuinely engaged with my explanations of technique and tradition. "This is incredible," he said one evening as I prepared my grandmother's secret mole recipe, a complex sauce requiring 28 ingredients and 2 days of preparation. "You don't just cook, you're preserving culture, creating art. I'm amazed by your talent." When he proposed 8 months later during a private dinner cruise on Puget Sound, presenting me with a stunning emerald-cut diamond while the city lights twinkled around us, I accepted without hesitation. Here was a man who seemed to truly understand and appreciate my passion. The warning signs appeared gradually, disguised as loving concern for our future together. Wedding planning became our first real conflict, though I didn't recognize it as such initially. Derek arrived at our consultation with premier wedding planner Victoria Sterling, carrying a detailed presentation outlining his vision for our celebration. When I mentioned we'd already visited a charming venue in Fremont that would allow me to personally cater our reception, incorporating my family's traditional recipes, he smiled as if I'd suggested something endearingly naive. Sweetheart, the Four Seasons has the prestige and capacity for the guest list we're working with, he explained, his hand covering mine across the polished conference table. Victoria has relationships with the city's top caterers who can handle an event of this magnitude. But I was hoping to create our menu myself, I said carefully. My restaurant could manage the catering, and it would be meaningful to share my family's culinary heritage on our wedding day. Victoria's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched diplomatically. How wonderfully authentic. However, wedding guests expect a certain level of sophistication and service standards. Perhaps we could incorporate one or two cultural elements as charming touches. Derek squeezed my hand gently. We want everything to be flawless, Kat. Victoria understands what works for our circle. My investors, my family's connections, they're accustomed to a particular standard.
Eventually, we compromised. His venue, his caterer, but I could provide empanadas during cocktail hour. It was the first of countless compromises that somehow always tilted toward Derek's preferences. The deeper problems emerged after our honeymoon when I decided to maintain my professional identity as Chef Catalina Morales, rather than completely adopting the Ashworth name in business contexts. I had spent years building my reputation in Seattle's competitive culinary scene, earning recognition from food critics and establishing a loyal customer base who specifically requested my creations. It's unconventional, Derek's mother, Vivian Ashworth, observed during our first family dinner at their Bellevue estate. The comment was delivered with the refined precision that managed to convey disapproval while maintaining plausible deniability. Ashworth women have traditionally embraced the family identity completely. Catalina has established her own career, Mom, Derek responded, though his defense lacked the strength I'd hoped for. His father, Jonathan Ashworth, founder of a successful venture capital firm and architect of Derek's relentless ambition, barely looked up from his tablet. It creates confusion in professional circles when spouses maintain competing brand identities. Clients prefer clarity about family priorities. These comments became increasingly frequent and pointed. At family gatherings, Vivian would casually reference other wives who had successfully transitioned into supporting their husbands' enterprises. Vanessa, Derek's sister, would discuss family business matters in front of me, then offer mock apologies. Sorry, Catalina, I forgot you've chosen to keep your restaurant commitments separate from family interests. I noticed subtle changes in my treatment at Ashworth family events. My place at dinner tables gradually shifted toward less prominent positions. Invitations to important business functions would arrive addressed to Derek Ashworth and guest. Holiday gifts became exercises in patronizing diminishment, while Vanessa's husband received thoughtful presents related to his architectural practice. I'd receive generic kitchen appliances with notes about supporting Derek's demanding schedule. Derek remained oblivious to these systematic slights, or chose to ignore them. His involvement with Nexus Technologies intensified as the company prepared for public offering, requiring constant travel and 18-hour workdays. His physical presence in our marriage diminished even as his expectations for domestic support increased. Most painful was watching Derek gradually adopt his family's condescending attitude toward my career. Wouldn't it make more sense to focus on private catering, he'd suggest after I'd worked a particularly grueling service at Corazon. You could set your own schedule, be more available for the important things. What important things, Derek? I asked, one exhausting evening, my patience finally wearing thin. Family obligations, networking events, building the life we're creating together. He replied, genuinely confused by my resistance. I tried explaining how I'd sacrificed everything to attend culinary school, how I'd built my restaurant's reputation through innovation and dedication, how cooking connected me to my cultural identity and provided purpose beyond our marriage. He'd listen with diminishing patience. "Nobody's asking you to stop cooking," he'd say dismissively. "Just be more strategic about it. Focus on what advances our shared goals." What Derek never grasped was that my goals weren't obstacles to his. They were simply my own. In his worldview, I would always be his wife first, a chef second, if at all. My friend Luna recognized the problem before I allowed myself to see it. Over coffee one gray Tuesday morning, she asked directly, "Kat, are you actually happy?" "Of course I am," I responded automatically. "Why would you ask that?" "Because you've changed. You're more careful now, like you're constantly calculating whether what you want to say is worth the potential conflict. That's not the fearless woman who opened a restaurant at 26. I dismissed her concerns initially, but her observation haunted me. Over the following months, I began noticing how I'd started shrinking myself to avoid friction. Canceling important industry events when Derek had last-minute client obligations, moderating my opinions during his business dinners, dressing more conservatively for Ashworth family functions. The Christmas Eve incident was simply the culmination of years of systematic erasure. The Ashworths hosted their annual holiday celebration at their estate, a formal affair bearing no resemblance to the warm, chaotic celebrations of my childhood. Despite my offer to contribute traditional Colombian dishes alongside the catered menu, Vivian had politely declined, citing menu cohesion. As we gathered in their formal dining room, Derek stood to deliver the traditional family toast. "I'm grateful for Nexus Technologies' continued success, for Dad's guidance in our expansion strategy, for Mom's elegance in hosting these gatherings, and for Vanessa's promotion to senior partner." His gaze settled on me with a smile that felt both affectionate and dismissive. "And of course, I'm grateful for Catalina, who creates such a beautiful home environment that allows me to focus completely on building our future." The toast reduced me to a supporting character in his narrative, my professional identity completely erased in favor of domestic function. Around the table, I saw polite smiles and raised glasses celebrating Derek's version of our life, one in which my achievements existed only to enhance his comfort. That evening, driving home through Seattle's twinkling holiday lights, Derek finally addressed my obvious discomfort. "You seemed distracted during dinner."
Did I? I replied carefully. I thought I was perfectly engaged. "You barely participated in the conversation. Mom asked if everything was all right with us." The fact that Vivian's observation was his primary concern, rather than my actual feelings, crystallized everything dysfunctional about our dynamic. "Everything's fine, Derek." "Excellent," he said, already mentally moving on. "By the way, the Harrison Group wants us to host a dinner party next month. Massive potential partnership. I told them you'd handle the menu. Something impressive, but not too intense. We want them comfortable." Not too intense. The casual dismissal of my cultural identity should have shocked me, but by then I'd grown numb to these small erasures. "Of course," I heard myself agree. "I'll plan something appropriate." What Derek couldn't have known was that my grandmother, Carmen Morales, had passed away 2 months earlier, leaving me something that would shatter his carefully constructed control. The certified letter from her estate attorney had arrived while Derek was in Silicon Valley for investor meetings, and I'd set it aside unopened, overwhelmed by grief and my demanding restaurant schedule. When I finally read it the morning after Christmas, sitting alone in our sterile kitchen while Derek attended an emergency board meeting, I discovered that Abuela had left me far more than her treasured recipes and jewelry. She had left me freedom itself, though I didn't fully understand it yet. The inheritance was substantial, not just money, but a stunning property in Costa Rica that she'd been quietly developing into a boutique eco-lodge.
There were also investment accounts I never knew existed, portfolios that had grown over decades of careful planning I'd never credited her with. But the most transformative part was her handwritten letter, written in both Spanish and English, explaining her deepest hopes for my future. Mi querida Catalina, if you're reading this, I'm already dancing with your grandfather in whatever beautiful place awaits strong women when their earthly work is finished. I've watched you these recent years, seeing how you've dimmed your magnificent light to make others comfortable. Your mother made similar choices when she was young, until she found courage to honor her own dreams. This inheritance isn't merely money, it's permission. Permission to remember who you were before you began apologizing for your ambitions. Permission to travel, to explore, to cook for people who will celebrate both your talent and your spirit. Permission to choose a life that honors rather than diminishes your gifts. The lodge in Costa Rica needs someone with your vision to make it extraordinary. But whether you choose that path or create another entirely, promise me you won't use this inheritance to make yourself smaller. The world desperately needs your complete flavor, mija, not some watered-down version designed to please people who were never worthy of your gifts. I read the letter 4 times before the magnitude of her gift fully registered. Not just financial security, but escape. A chance to discover who I might become if I stopped editing myself for Derek's approval. The property photographs showed elegant treehouse suites connected by suspended walkways through pristine rainforest canopy, with breathtaking views of both mountains and ocean. It was spectacular, but more importantly, it was entirely mine, completely beyond Derek's influence or control. That night, as Derek recounted his board meeting while I prepared his favorite cioppino, I felt like I was observing our life from a distant planet. This man who claimed to love me had spent 8 years systematically erasing everything that made me unique, repackaging my identity as a convenience that enhanced his lifestyle. Harrison was impressed by our holiday party idea. I emphasized your culinary background, really sold your credentials, should definitely help close this partnership. The casual appropriation of my achievements to serve his business interests was so routine I'd stopped noticing. But tonight, with Abuela's letter burning in my mind, I heard it with perfect clarity. What if I said no? I asked, surprising myself with the question. No to what, exactly? To hosting the dinner, to playing the charming hostess for your business partners, to pretending my cooking is just a delightful hobby that happens to benefit your career. He set down his spoon, studying me with the careful attention he usually reserved for problematic investors. Catalina, you're not abandoning anything. You're using your talents to build our life together. That's what partnership means. Partnership, I repeated slowly. When was the last time you supported one of my goals that didn't directly serve your interests? The question hung between us like a chasm neither could cross. Derek opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, apparently unable to produce a single example. The silence stretched until he finally said, I think you're being overly emotional, Kat. We have an incredible life. Don't let whatever's bothering you destroy what we've built together. As I cleaned our dishes that night, moving through familiar domestic motions, I realized Derek wasn't necessarily evil. He was simply a man raised to believe women existed to enhance men's lives, and I had spent 8 years confirming that worldview. But now I had choices. Now I had Abuela's gift of possibility glowing in my heart like a secret star. The only question was whether I possessed the courage to use it. We poured our hearts into researching and telling the story. If you're hooked, show some love with a subscribe. Now, where were we? The Harrison Group dinner party was scheduled for Valentine's Day weekend, a cruel irony that wasn't lost on me as I planned a menu designed to impress Derek's potential business partners while my marriage crumbled beneath the surface of domestic perfection. For 2 weeks after discovering Abuela's inheritance, I moved through our penthouse like a ghost haunting my own life. Derek remained oblivious to my internal transformation, focused entirely on the upcoming partnership deal that could value Nexus Technologies at over $200 million. Remember, nothing too spicy for the Harrison dinner, he reminded me for the third time that week, barely looking up from his laptop as I prepared his morning espresso. David Harrison grew up in Connecticut. His palate is pretty traditional. Think sophisticated American cuisine with maybe just a hint of your background. A hint of my background. As if my Colombian heritage was a seasoning to be used sparingly, carefully measured so as not to overwhelm the delicate sensibilities of wealthy white investors. Of course, I replied automatically, though inside I was screaming. How many times had I diluted myself, literally and figuratively, to make others comfortable? How many signature dishes had I simplified? How many stories had I left untold? How many parts of my identity had I tucked away like embarrassing family secrets? The morning of the dinner party, everything began unraveling faster than I could have imagined. It started with a phone call from my business partner, Elena, at Cortesan. "Kat, we have a problem," she said without preamble when I answered. "The Times food critic called. She wants to feature us in next month's Rising Stars spotlight, but she needs to interview both owners this afternoon. This could change everything for the restaurant." My heart raced. The Seattle Times food section was the holy grail of local restaurant coverage. A feature story could triple our reservations overnight, establish us as serious players in the city's culinary scene. "That's incredible news," I said, already calculating how I could rearrange my day. "What time does she want to meet?" 2:00 at the restaurant. She specifically wants to discuss your fusion techniques and how you've incorporated your family's traditional recipes into Pacific Northwest cuisine. I glanced at the clock. It was already 10:30, and I had planned to spend the entire day preparing for Derek's dinner party. The Harrison Group executives were arriving at 7, expecting a flawless evening that could seal Derek's most important business deal. "Elena, I started, then stopped. Why was I hesitating? This was my career, my dream, my one chance at the kind of recognition I'd worked toward for years. "I'll be there," I said firmly. "This is too important to miss." After hanging up, I immediately called our usual catering service, explaining that I needed emergency help for the evening's dinner party. They could handle the main courses, and I would focus on appetizers and dessert, a reasonable compromise that would still allow me to attend the interview. When Derek emerged from his home office 20 minutes later, I broke the news as gently as possible. "The Times wants to feature Corazon," I explained, barely containing my excitement. "This could be huge for us, Derek, the kind of exposure that transforms a restaurant from neighborhood spot to destination." His expression shifted from confusion to irritation in seconds. "Today? You're telling me this today? The critic called this morning. These opportunities don't wait for convenient timing." Derek ran his hand through his perfectly styled hair, a gesture I'd learned meant he was strategizing how to regain control of a situation. "Catalina, the Harrison dinner is tonight. Do you understand how important this partnership is? We're talking about the future of my company." "And this interview is about the future of mine," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "I've arranged for Bella Vista Catering to handle the main courses. Everything will be perfect." "Catered food?" Derek's voice rose incredulously. "I told David Harrison that my wife would be personally preparing dinner, that her culinary expertise was part of what made this evening special. Now you want to serve him generic catered meals?" The casual way he reduced my professional skills to a selling point for his business deal crystallized everything wrong with our dynamic. "My cooking isn't a party trick to impress your investors." "That's not what I meant," he backtracked quickly, recognizing he had overstepped. "Your talent is incredible, obviously, but tonight isn't about your restaurant. It's about our future together. Can't this interview be rescheduled?" You don't reschedule the Seattle Times, and you don't ask your life partner to sacrifice a career-defining opportunity for a dinner party. We stared at each other across our gleaming kitchen island, the marble surface suddenly feeling like an ocean between us. In that moment, I saw our entire relationship with perfect clarity. Every compromise I'd made, every time I'd chosen his comfort over my ambitions, every instance I'd made myself smaller to fit into his vision of the perfect wife.
"I'm going to the interview," I said quietly. The catering will be excellent, and your business dinner will be successful. But I won't miss this opportunity. Derek's jaw tightened in the way that usually preceded his most cutting remarks. Fine. But when David Harrison asks why the woman who was supposed to showcase her culinary talents is nowhere to be found, I'll be sure to explain that your restaurant took priority over our marriage. The threat was clear. This would become ammunition for future arguments, evidence of my selfishness that he'd deploy whenever convenient. For 8 years, that threat would have worked. The old Catalina would have canceled the interview, apologized for being unreasonable, and spent the day crafting the perfect menu to advance Derek's interests. But Abuela's letter had awakened something fierce inside me, a voice that refused to be silenced anymore. "You do that," I said, grabbing my purse and heading for the door. "And while you're explaining my absence, maybe consider whether a woman who puts her husband's business dinners above her own career achievements is really the partner you want, or just the accessory you've been trying to create." The interview at Corazon was everything I dreamed it could be. Food critic Margaret Chen was knowledgeable, insightful, and genuinely excited about our fusion approach. She understood immediately how I was honoring my grandmother's recipes while creating something entirely new. "Your arroz con pollo verde is revolutionary," she said after tasting our signature dish. "You've taken this beloved comfort food and elevated it without losing its soul. The way you've incorporated local Dungeness crab with traditional sofrito, it's exactly what modern American cuisine should be." For 2 hours, I spoke passionately about flavor profiles, cultural preservation, and culinary innovation. I discussed my vision for expanding Corazon's impact, my dreams of publishing a cookbook that celebrated the complexity of Latin fusion cuisine. "Your husband must be incredibly proud," Margaret said as we concluded, "having a partner who understands the demands of building something meaningful." The comment hit like a physical blow. I realized that in 2 hours of discussing my deepest professional passions, I hadn't mentioned Derek once. The most important aspects of my identity existed completely separate from our marriage. "He's very supportive," I lied smoothly, though the words tasted bitter. I returned home at 5:30 to find our penthouse transformed into an elegant dinner party setup. The catering team had executed everything flawlessly. Beautiful presentations, sophisticated flavors, an impressive spread that would undoubtedly impress the Harrison group. Derek emerged from our bedroom in his custom-tailored navy suit, looking every inch the successful tech entrepreneur. His expression was coldly polite, the face he wore when managing difficult business relationships. "Everything looks lovely," I said, attempting to bridge the tension between us. Bella Vista really outdid themselves. "Yes, well, we'll see how our guests respond to the substitution," he replied without looking at me. "I've explained that you had an unavoidable commitment, though I'm sure they'll find it interesting that preparing dinner for them wasn't your priority." The passive-aggressive barb was typical Derek, designed to make me feel guilty while maintaining plausible deniability. A year ago, it would have worked. Tonight, it just made me tired. "I'm going to change," I said simply. As I dressed for the evening, selecting a burgundy silk dress that Derek had always complimented, I felt like I was putting on a costume for a role I no longer wanted to play. The woman in the mirror looked polished and appropriate, but she wasn't me anymore. She was Derek's version of me, carefully edited for public consumption. The Harrison Group executives arrived precisely at 7, and I slipped effortlessly into my practiced role as the charming hostess. David Harrison was exactly what I'd expected. Mid-50s, silver-haired, with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to having his preferences accommodated. "Mrs. Ashworth, Derek has told us so much about your culinary talents. I understand you're quite the chef." "I enjoy cooking," I replied modestly, the response Derek preferred when I was asked about my career. "I hope you'll enjoy tonight's menu." "Derek mentioned you have a restaurant?" Patricia asked with polite interest. "A small place in Capitol Hill," I said, downplaying Corazon's growing reputation. "Nothing too ambitious." From across the room, Derek caught my eye and nodded approvingly. This was the version of me he preferred, successful enough to be interesting, modest enough not to overshadow him. Dinner proceeded smoothly. the catered food earning genuine compliments from our guests. I guided conversation expertly, asking thoughtful questions about the Harrison Group's expansion plans while sharing carefully edited anecdotes about Seattle's restaurant scene. "You're quite knowledgeable about the hospitality industry," David Harrison observed over dessert. "Have you considered how that expertise might translate to other ventures?" It was an opening to discuss my actual ambitions, my vision for expanding Corazon, my dreams of creating a culinary brand that celebrated Latin fusion cuisine. Instead, I heard myself deflecting. "I'm more interested in supporting Derek's work with Nexus Technologies. His innovations in sustainable tech are really changing the industry." Derek beamed at my response, reaching over to squeeze my hand proudly. Around the table, the Harrison Group executives nodded approvingly at this display of wifely support. But inside, I felt something die. The woman who had spoken passionately to Margaret Chen that afternoon about culinary innovation and cultural preservation had vanished, replaced by this hollow performance of feminine domesticity.
As our guests prepared to leave, David Harrison pulled Derek aside for a private conversation while I made polite small talk with Patricia Harrison about Seattle's cultural attractions. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights sparkled like fallen stars, and I felt more disconnected from my own life than ever before. "Lovely evening," Patricia said as they gathered their coats. "You and Derek make such a perfect team." Perfect team. The phrase echoed in my mind as I cleaned up after our guests departed. Derek was effusive with praise, clearly energized by the successful evening. "Harrison loved you," he said, loosening his tie. He mentioned how refreshing it was to meet a woman who understood her role in her husband's success. I think tonight sealed the deal. Her role in her husband's success. Not her own success, not her own dreams, but her function in advancing someone else's ambitions. "I'm glad it went well," I managed. "It went perfectly," Derek continued, pouring himself a celebratory scotch. "And honestly, the catered food was probably better than if you'd been stressed and rushing to cook all day. Maybe we should consider this approach for a future entertaining." The casual dismissal of my cooking, the very talent he'd spent 4 years claiming to admire, was the final crack in the foundation of whatever remained of our marriage. "Derek," I said quietly, "what if I told you I was thinking about expanding Corazon, opening a second location, maybe writing a cookbook?" He paused, glass halfway to his lips. "Is this about that interview today? Catalina, you can't make major business decisions based on one conversation with a food critic." "It's not about the interview. It's about my future, my dreams." Derek set down his drink, his expression shifting to the patient concern he used when I was being unrealistic. "Your restaurant is charming, and I'm proud of what you've accomplished, but expanding requires significant capital, enormous time commitments, and frankly, more risk than makes sense for us right now. Nexus Technologies is at a critical growth phase. I need to know my partner is focused on our shared goals." Our shared goals. Always our shared goals, which somehow consistently aligned with Derek's individual ambitions while requiring me to sacrifice mine. "What if my goals aren't the same as yours?" I asked. The question hung between us like a bridge on fire. Derek studied me carefully, perhaps recognizing for the first time that the woman he'd shaped to fit his life might have her own inconvenient desires. "I think you're confused," he said finally. "Tonight was a perfect example of what we can accomplish together. You were brilliant, charming, supportive, everything that makes our partnership work. Why would you want to complicate that with unnecessary risks?" Unnecessary risks. That's what he called my dreams, unnecessary complications to the life he designed for us. Standing in our perfect kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of a successful evening that had required me to erase myself completely, I finally understood what Abuela was trying to tell me. This inheritance wasn't just money. It was permission to stop apologizing for wanting more than the role Derek had assigned to me. "I'm going to bed," I said simply. As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I could feel Derek watching me, perhaps sensing that something fundamental had shifted between us. Tomorrow, I would make the call that would change everything. Tonight, I would lie beside the man I'd once loved desperately and plan my escape from the beautiful prison he had built around my life. The woman who had asked permission to visit the grocery store was finally ready to disappear. In her place, someone braver was being born. The next morning, Derek left early for his office, still riding high from the successful Harrison dinner. I waited until I heard his Tesla pull out of our building's garage before making the call that would shatter the carefully constructed facade of our marriage. "Rodriguez and Associates," came the crisp voice of Abuela's estate attorney. "This is Catalina Morales. I need to discuss my grandmother's inheritance, specifically the Costa Rica property." Within 2 hours, I was sitting in Maria Rodriguez's downtown office, reviewing documents that revealed the true scope of what Abuela had built. The Eco Lodge wasn't just a small boutique property. It was a thriving business that had been generating substantial income for over a decade. "Your grandmother was remarkably astute," Maria explained, spreading architectural plans across her desk. "She purchased this land 20 years ago when Costa Rica was just beginning to develop ecotourism. The Lodge Luna encompasses 47 acres of pristine rainforest with 12 luxury treehouse suites, a spa, and an award-winning restaurant." I stared at the photographs in amazement. Elevated walkways connected stunning accommodations suspended among ancient trees, while floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of both volcanic mountains and Caribbean coastline. This wasn't just an inheritance, it was a fully operational business that could provide complete financial independence. "And the restaurant?" I asked, my chef's instincts immediately engaged. Maria smiled. "That's where your expertise would be transformative. Currently, they serve competent international cuisine, but your grandmother always envisioned something more authentic. She believed that combining your culinary training with Costa Rican ingredients and techniques could elevate Lodge Luna into a true destination dining experience."
As I reviewed the financial statements, my hands trembled slightly. The lodge generated more annual income than Derek and I made combined. This wasn't just escape money, it was empire-building capital. "When could I visit the property?" I asked. "Carlos suggested next week if possible. The dry season is ending soon, and he'd like your input on several expansion projects before the rains begin." I scheduled the trip for the following Thursday, telling Derek I was visiting my cousin in San Diego. The lie came surprisingly easily, though it left me feeling hollow. 8 years of marriage, and I was now actively deceiving the man I'd once trusted with everything. That evening, Derek returned home energized by his meeting with the Harrison Group. The partnership was moving forward faster than anticipated, requiring him to travel to Boston the following week for final negotiations. "This could close by month end," he said, loosening his tie as I prepared dinner. David Harrison was so impressed by Tuesday night that he's expediting their entire approval process. "That's wonderful," I replied, though my mind was already thousands of miles away, imagining myself walking through rainforest canopies and planning menus featuring exotic Costa Rican ingredients. "I was thinking," Derek continued, pouring himself wine, "maybe it's time we started seriously discussing children. With the Harrison partnership secured, I'll have more flexibility to focus on family life." The comment stopped me cold. Children had been a theoretical future discussion throughout our marriage, something we'd revisit once his business reached certain milestones. Now, with my newfound freedom literally within reach, the idea of becoming more tied to Derek felt suffocating. "I thought you wanted to establish Nexus Technologies' public offering first," I said carefully. "That's still the plan, but the Harrison partnership accelerates everything. We could have the IPO within 18 months, and by then, having a family would actually enhance my profile with investors, show stability, long-term thinking. Having a family would enhance his profile. Not because he desperately wanted children, not because we'd built a relationship foundation strong enough to support raising another human being, but because parenthood would improve his business image. I'd like to focus on Corazon's expansion first," I said, testing his reaction. Derek's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Kat, we discussed this. The restaurant is a lovely hobby, but it's not our primary income source. Children are a much more significant investment in our future. Hobby. After 8 years of marriage, he still considered my professional passion a hobby that he could dismiss whenever convenient. The Times interview went really well. Margaret Chen thinks we have potential for significant growth. Food critics say encouraging things to everyone, Derek replied dismissively. That doesn't translate to sustainable business expansion. Look, I admire your creativity, but we need to be realistic about priorities. That night, as Derek made enthusiastic love to me, while probably calculating conception timing, I stared at the ceiling and felt like a stranger in my own body. This man who claimed to love me had just reduced my life's work to a hobby while discussing children as business strategy enhancements. Thursday morning, I boarded a plane to San Jose while Derek flew to Boston, both of us traveling toward futures that would determine whether our marriage could survive. Costa Rica overwhelmed my senses from the moment I stepped off the plane. The air was thick with humidity and the scent of tropical flowers, while brilliant green mountains rose like ancient guardians around the valley. Carlos Mendoza met me at the airport, a warm, energetic man in his 50s who could clearly have loved working with my grandmother. "Señora Carmen spoke of you constantly," he said as we drove through winding mountain roads toward the lodge. "She always said you had inherited her vision for creating experiences that nourish both body and soul." The approach to Lodge Luna took my breath away. We climbed through dense rainforest on a private road, emerging into a clearing where elegant tree houses seemed to float among the canopy like wooden birds. The main lodge building blended seamlessly with its natural surroundings, all warm wood and flowing lines that suggested organic growth rather than construction. Your suite, apparently Abuela's personal accommodation during her visits, was a marvel of sustainable luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of mountains and ocean, while natural ventilation and solar power maintained perfect comfort without environmental impact. I could have lived in that single room and felt like royalty. But the restaurant is where I fell completely in love. The open-air dining pavilion featured a professional kitchen that would make any chef weep with envy. Top-quality equipment, abundant prep space, and direct access to gardens where Abuela had cultivated herbs and vegetables using traditional techniques she'd learned from local farmers. "She always said this space was waiting for you," Carlos said quietly, "that someday you would come and show us what Costa Rican fusion cuisine could become."
Over the next 3 days, I immersed myself in every aspect of the lodge's operations. I learned about the sustainable farming practices that supplied our kitchen, studied the relationships with local communities that provided authentic cultural experiences for guests, and tasted my way through markets in nearby villages, discovering ingredients I'd never imagined. The revelation came gradually, then all at once. This wasn't just a business opportunity. It was the life I'd been unconsciously preparing for my entire career. Every fusion technique I'd developed at Corazon, every cultural bridge I'd built between my Colombian heritage and Pacific Northwest ingredients, had been practiced for this moment. "Carlos," I said on my final evening as we watched the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors from the dining pavilion, "what would it take to expand the restaurant program? Make it a true destination, rather than just lodge dining?" His eyes lit up with excitement. "Your grandmother and I discussed this many times. We would need to hire additional staff, develop relationships with more local suppliers, perhaps create cooking classes and cultural immersion experiences. But with your expertise," he gestured toward the kitchen, "this could become the finest farm-to-table restaurant in Central America." That night, I called Derek from my treehouse suite. He was exhausted from intense negotiations, but energized by the progress. "The Harrison deal is basically done," he said. "Just finalizing a few contract details. I should be home Saturday evening." "That's fantastic,"
I said, though my enthusiasm felt hollow. "How's your cousin?" he asked absently, clearly distracted by laptop work. "She's well. It's been good to reconnect with family." We exchanged a few more pleasantries before hanging up, and I realized we'd shared no meaningful information about our respective experiences. Derek hadn't asked what I'd been doing, what I'd discovered, whether I was enjoying myself. I was simply an expected check-in, a domestic responsibility he was fulfilling while focused on more important matters. Saturday morning, as I prepared to leave Costa Rica, Carlos walked me through the financial projections for expanding the restaurant program. The numbers were staggering. With proper investment in marketing, Lodge Luna could triple its revenue within 2 years, while becoming an internationally recognized culinary destination. "Your grandmother left detailed notes about her vision," he said, handing me a leather portfolio. "She believed you would eventually find your way here, and she wanted you to have everything you needed to make it extraordinary." On the plane back to Seattle, I read through Abuela's notes with growing amazement. She had been planning this transition for years, quietly building a business that would give me complete creative and financial freedom. Every sustainable practice, every community relationship, every design detail had been chosen with my eventual leadership in mind. But the most stunning revelation was buried in the final pages. Financial records showing that Abuela had been secretly supporting Corazon for years. Anonymous investments that had allowed Elena and I to upgrade our equipment, expand our menu, survive the lean early months when we were building our reputation. She had been orchestrating my escape long before I realized I needed one. Derek picked me up at the airport, full of enthusiasm about the Harrison partnership, but barely curious about my trip. As we drove through Seattle's familiar streets toward our penthouse, I felt like I was returning to a foreign country. "You're quiet," he observed as we waited at a red light. "Everything okay with your cousin?" "Everything is fine," I lied, "just tired from traveling." That night, as Derek celebrated his business success with expensive champagne, I sat in our bathroom rereading Abuela's final letter again, the one that had started this entire transformation. But now I noticed something I'd missed before, a postscript written in different ink, apparently added later. "P.S. Remember, mija, that sometimes the people who claim to love us are actually terrified of who we might become if we stopped making ourselves small for their comfort. Your worth was never dependent on anyone's approval, least of all, someone who benefits from your diminishment. Trust your instincts. Trust your strength. Trust that you deserve a life as vast and magnificent as your dreams." Reading those words in the marble bathroom of a penthouse that had never felt like home, I finally understood what I had to do. The secret I'd been carrying for a week was about to explode into our carefully constructed life, and nothing would ever be the same. Tomorrow, I would tell Derek about Costa Rica. I would tell him about the inheritance, about the life I could build there, about the woman I was ready to become. And his reaction would determine whether our marriage had any hope of survival, or if it had already been dead longer than either of us wanted to admit. But tonight, I would hold my secret close like a flame, knowing that whatever happened next, I finally had options. I finally had power. I finally had a future that belonged entirely to me. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning in March, over coffee and croissants in our gleaming kitchen, while Seattle's gray drizzle painted abstract patterns on our floor-to-ceiling windows. Derek was scrolling through his tablet, reviewing quarterly projections for Nexus Technologies, when I finally found the courage to shatter our carefully maintained illusion. "Derek, we need to talk about something important." He glanced up briefly, then returned to his screen. "Can it wait? I have the board meeting at 9, and these revenue numbers need to be perfect." "It can't wait," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's about my grandmother's inheritance, about Costa Rica." That got his attention. Derek set down his tablet, his expression shifting from distracted annoyance to sharp focus. "Costa Rica? I thought you visited your cousin in San Diego." The moment of truth had arrived. I lied. I spent the week at an eco-lodge that my grandmother owned and left to me. It's not just a property, Derek. It's a thriving business that generates more income than both our careers combined. Silence stretched between us like a fault line preparing to split. Derek's jaw worked soundlessly before he managed to speak. You lied to me. For an entire week, you lied about where you were. Yes, I did. I met his gaze directly, refusing to apologize for protecting myself while I figured out my options. Because I knew you'd try to control the situation before I had a chance to understand what Abuela had given me. Control? Derek's voice rose incredulously. I'm your husband, Catalina. We make major decisions together. You don't get to inherit significant assets and explore them in secret like we're business partners instead of a married couple. When have we ever made major decisions together? I challenged. When you chose our wedding venue, our apartment, our social circle, our dinner party guest lists? Every significant choice in our marriage has been presented to me as a fait accompli, with my input being purely cosmetic. Derek stood abruptly, beginning to pace our kitchen's marble expanse like a caged predator. That's completely unfair. I've always considered your opinions. You've considered my compliance. There's a difference. He stopped pacing, fixing me with the intimidating stare he used on difficult investors. Explain to me how inheriting property in a foreign country, property significant enough to generate substantial income, is something you handle unilaterally. How is that compatible with marriage? I pulled out the leather portfolio Carlos had given me, spreading financial documents across our breakfast counter. Because this isn't just an inheritance, Derek. It's my future. Lodge Luna is exactly what I've been unconsciously preparing for my entire career. A place where I can create the kind of culinary experience I've always dreamed about. Derek scanned the documents, his expression growing darker as he absorbed the revenue figures and expansion projections. This is fantasy, Catalina. Running a business in Costa Rica? You don't speak business-level Spanish, you have no experience with international operations, and you'd be completely isolated from everything you know. I speak perfect Spanish, actually, though I've gotten so used to English being our default that you probably forgot. The barb landed visibly. In 8 years of marriage, Derek had never bothered to become conversational in Spanish, never shown interest in communicating with my parents in their preferred language, never considered that his linguistic limitations might be isolating for me. Fine, he conceded grudgingly, but the rest stands. This is an enormous risk that affects both our futures. What about children? What about the life we've built here? What about my dreams? I countered. What about the possibility that our life here has been suffocating me slowly for years? Derek's expression shifted to the patient concern he reserved for my most irrational moments. Catalina, I understand you're feeling restless. It's natural after inheriting something unexpected, but we can't make permanent decisions based on temporary emotions. Temporary emotions? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Derek, I've been disappearing piece by piece since we got married. I've watched you reduce my professional identity to a charming hobby, dismiss my cultural heritage as something to be minimized for your comfort, and treat my ambitions as obstacles to your vision of our perfect life. That's not true, he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Last week, you called my restaurant expansion plans unnecessary risks while suggesting we have children to enhance your IPO profile. Do you hear yourself? Do you understand how that sounds to someone whose dreams you're supposed to support? Derek ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing, but now recognized as his tell when he was calculating how to regain control of a conversation. Look, maybe I haven't been as supportive as I should have been, he admitted carefully. But that doesn't mean the solution is running away to Central America to play resort chef.
play resort chef. Even his attempts at conciliation contained casual dismissals of my professional capabilities. "This isn't running away," I said, gathering the documents into a neat stack. "This is running toward something, toward a future where my talents are valued rather than tolerated." "And what am I in this future?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Am I supposed to abandon everything I've built here to follow you on some culinary adventure?" The question hung between us like a challenge. For a moment, I tried to imagine Derek at Lodge Luna, his pressed shirts and Italian leather shoes navigating elevated rainforest walkways, his impatience with anything that couldn't be optimized or quantified, clashing with Costa Rica's more relaxed rhythms.
"I don't know," I admitted honestly. "I can't picture you there, and I don't think you can either." Something dangerous flashed in Derek's eyes. "So this is it? You inherit some property and suddenly our 8-year marriage is expendable?" "Our marriage became expendable the moment you stopped seeing me as an equal partner and started treating me like a supporting character in your story." Derek slammed his palm against the counter, making our coffee cups rattle. "Everything I've done has been for us, Catalina. The business success, the networking, the financial security, it's all been about building a foundation for our future together." "Your future," I corrected, "with me as an accessory that makes it more appealing." "That's incredibly unfair," he snapped. "I've provided you with a beautiful home, financial freedom, social connections. You've provided me with a beautiful prison, one where I could pursue my little hobbies as long as they didn't interfere with your real priorities." Derek stared at me like I'd become a stranger, which perhaps I had. The woman who asked permission to buy groceries had been replaced by someone who was no longer afraid of his disapproval. "Fine," he said finally, his voice cold with finality. "If that's how you see our marriage, maybe we need to seriously reconsider our future together." The threat that would have terrified me a month ago now felt like liberation. Maybe we do. "You're not thinking clearly," Derek said, his tone shifting to the condescending patience he used when I was being emotional. "You're overwhelmed by unexpected possibilities and not considering the consequences. Take some time to process this inheritance rationally." "I am thinking clearly. For the first time in years, actually." Derek checked his Rolex, apparently deciding this conversation had consumed enough of his valuable time. "I have to go. This discussion isn't over, but I can't be late for the board meeting. When I get home tonight, we'll talk about realistic ways to handle this inheritance that don't involve destroying our life together." After he left, I sat alone in our silent penthouse, surrounded by the expensive furniture and designer accessories that had never felt like home. The morning's confrontation had crystallized something I'd been avoiding. Derek and I wanted fundamentally different futures, and no amount of compromise could bridge that gap. By afternoon, I'd made 3 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to Carlos, telling him I wanted to move forward with expanding Lodge Luna's restaurant program. The second was to Elena, explaining that I needed to sell my share of Corazon to pursue an opportunity in Costa Rica. The third was to a divorce attorney recommended by my friend, Luna. 8-year marriage, significant assets, potential international relocation. This will be complex, but Washington is a community property state which protects your interests in marital assets. "What about the inheritance?" I asked. "Property inherited during marriage typically remains separate, especially if it came with specific conditions about your personal involvement. From what you've described, your grandmother's bequest appears designed to provide you with independent options." That evening, Derek returned home with flowers and an expensive bottle of wine, his standard peace offering after difficult conversations. I was sitting at our dining table with Costa Rica guidebooks and business plans spread across the surface when he walked in. "What's all this?" he asked, setting down the flowers with forced casualness. "Research," I replied simply. "I've decided to move to Costa Rica and take over Lodge Luna's operations." Derek's careful composure cracked. "Catalina, we agreed to discuss this rationally." "I decided to manage the situation. I decided to take control of my own life. I gestured to the documents. I've already spoken with Carlos about expansion timelines and contacted a divorce attorney about protecting my inheritance during asset division. Divorce attorney? Derek's voice was barely controlled. You called a divorce lawyer without discussing it with me first? The same way you've made countless decisions about our life without my meaningful input? I said calmly. It turns out unilateral decision-making feels very different depending on which side you're on. Derek sank into the chair across from me, his confident facade finally crumbling. Kat, please don't do this. Whatever problems we have, we can work them out. Marriage requires compromise. I've been compromising for 8 years. I compromised my name, my career ambitions, my cultural identity, my independence. I've compromised until there's almost nothing left of who I used to be. But we love each other, he said desperately. That has to count for something. I looked at this man I'd shared a bed with for nearly a decade, searching for any trace of the person who'd once asked thoughtful questions about my cooking techniques. Do you love me, Derek? Or do you love the version of me that you've spent years creating? He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, apparently unable to distinguish between the two. I'm leaving for Costa Rica next month, I said, beginning to gather my research materials. You can have the penthouse, the furniture, the life we built here. I just want my freedom and the chance to discover who I might have become if I'd never learned to make myself small. As I headed upstairs to pack, Derek called after me one final time. Catalina, if you leave like this, there's no coming back. You understand that, right? I paused at the bottom of our spiral staircase, looking back at the man who'd spent 8 years convincing me that his vision of our future was the only one worth pursuing. I'm counting on it, I said simply, and climbed the stairs toward the rest of my life. 6 months later, I was kneeling in Costa Rican soil, harvesting purple basil for the evening's tasting menu, when my phone chimed with a notification I'd been expecting for weeks. The divorce papers had been finalized. Catalina Rodriguez, I'd legally reclaimed my maiden name, was officially free. I sat back on my heels, soil-stained hands holding the device that had just confirmed the end of one life and the beginning of another. Around me, the gardens of Lodge Luna stretched in terraced abundance down the mountainside, every herb and vegetable a testament to the sustainable vision Abuela had spent decades nurturing. The morning Derek had returned from his Boston trip to find half our penthouse empty and a formal separation notice on his pillow felt like another lifetime. His cycle of rage, bargaining, and cold silence had played out exactly as I'd expected, each phase confirming that I'd made the right choice. The most telling moment had come during our final face-to-face meeting to divide assets. Derek, flanked by his attorney, had attempted one last manipulation disguised as reconciliation. Catalina, I've been thinking about what you said. He'd begun, his voice carefully modulated for maximum emotional impact. Maybe I have been too controlling. What if we kept the penthouse as a home base, but you could spend summers in Costa Rica developing this restaurant concept? Best of both worlds. Even his concessions were designed to maintain his control, offering me seasonal access to my own dreams while keeping me tethered to his world for the majority of each year. The woman who'd asked permission to buy groceries might have been tempted by this olive branch. The woman I'd become simply smiled and declined. I'm not interested in managing my life around your comfort level anymore, Derek. His face had hardened instantly, the mask of reasonableness dropping away. Fine, but don't come crawling back when your tropical fantasy falls apart, when you realize that running a business in a developing country isn't the same as playing chef in your Costa Rican vacation rental. Even in defeat, he couldn't resist diminishing my capabilities. Some patterns die hard. Now, months later, I could barely remember why I'd ever found his approval necessary. Lodge Luna had become more than a business.
It was a daily affirmation that I was capable of far more than Derek had ever imagined. The restaurant transformation had exceeded even Carlos's optimistic projections. Within 3 months of my arrival, we'd developed partnerships with 12 local farms, created a training program for indigenous women to share traditional cooking techniques with guests, and established Lodge Luna as the premier farm-to-table destination in the region. Food and Wine magazine had featured us in their World's Best Eco Dining issue with a 2-page spread showcasing my signature dish, a modern interpretation of gallo pinto that incorporated ancient grains and locally foraged ingredients. The article's headline read, "Chef Catalina Rodriguez, Redefining Sustainable Luxury in Costa Rica's Cloud Forest." Reading my name in print, my real name, associated with work I was genuinely proud of, had made me cry tears of joy I hadn't known I was capable of producing. But the professional success was only part of my transformation. Living at Lodge Luna had reconnected me with aspects of myself I'd forgotten existed. I woke each morning to the sounds of howler monkeys and exotic birds rather than Seattle traffic. I ended each day watching sunset paint the Pacific Ocean in impossible colors rather than staring at Derek's laptop screen across our marble dining table. Most importantly, I'd remembered what it felt like to be appreciated for my authentic self, rather than a carefully edited version designed for someone else's comfort. The guests who came to Lodge Luna weren't just seeking luxury accommodations. They were looking for transformative experiences that connected them with local culture and natural beauty. Every meal became an opportunity to share stories about the ingredients' origins, the farmers who grew them, and the traditional techniques I'd learned from village grandmothers who'd become my mentors. "Chef Catalina," called Sophia, one of our servers, interrupting my garden reverie, "the photography crew from Travel and Leisure has arrived for the sunset shoot." I smiled, brushing soil from my hands. Travel and Leisure was preparing a feature story about Lodge Luna for their Transformative Escapes issue. Apparently, my story of leaving corporate Seattle to create something meaningful in Costa Rica had captured their imagination. As I walked back toward the main lodge, I caught my reflection in the office windows and barely recognized myself. The woman looking back had sun-streaked hair, laugh lines around her eyes, and the kind of confidence posture that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. The photographer, an energetic woman named Rachel, who'd arrived from New York that morning, was setting up equipment on the dining pavilion when I approached. "Chef Rodriguez, perfect timing. I was hoping to capture you in your element, maybe preparing something signature while we talk about your journey here." For the next hour, I moved through my kitchen preparing a tasting menu while answering Rachel's thoughtful questions about the transition from Seattle to Costa Rica, from corporate wife to independent entrepreneur.
"What was the hardest part of leaving your old life behind?" she asked as I caramelized plantains with local honey. "Learning to trust my own judgment again," I answered honestly. I'd spent so many years deferring to someone else's vision of what my life should look like that I'd forgotten how to listen to my own instincts. And the most rewarding part? I paused, considering the question while arranging microgreens from our garden on each plate. Discovering that the life I thought was impossible was actually the only one worth living. That evening, after the photo shoot concluded and our guests had lingered over dinner until well past midnight, I found myself on my private terrace reviewing business plans for our next expansion. Carlos and I were discussing the possibility of opening a second location, a beachfront property near Manuel Antonio that would focus on coastal cuisine and ocean-to-table dining. My phone buzzed with a message from Elena back in Seattle. She'd successfully taken over my share of Corazon and was thriving as the sole owner, having recently earned a James Beard nomination for Outstanding Chef in the Pacific Northwest. Saw the Travel plus Leisure announcement on their Instagram. "So proud of you, Imana. You're living the dream we used to talk about during those crazy opening weeks."
I smiled, remembering those early days when Elena and I had fantasized about opening restaurants around the world, creating culinary experiences that celebrated our heritage while pushing creative boundaries. At the time, those dreams had seemed impossibly ambitious. Now they felt like natural next steps. Another message appeared, this one from an unknown number. Saw your interview in Food and Wine. Impressive what you've built. Hope you're happy. Derek. I stared at the message for a long moment, trying to feel something beyond mild surprise. The man who'd once dominated my emotional landscape had become a distant memory, someone I'd known in a previous lifetime. I deleted the message without responding. As I prepared for bed in my treehouse suite, I reflected on the year that had changed everything. 12 months ago, I'd been Catalina Ashworth, playing a supporting role in someone else's story. Tonight, I was Catalina Rodriguez, the lead character in a narrative of my own creation. The irony wasn't lost on me that Derek's prediction had been partially correct. Running a business in Costa Rica was nothing like playing chef in a vacation rental. It was infinitely more challenging and exponentially more rewarding. Tomorrow, I would wake up and continue building something extraordinary. I would train local cooks in fusion techniques, collaborate with environmental scientists on sustainable farming practices, and create dining experiences that transformed how people thought about food and culture. But tonight, I would fall asleep to the sound of tree frogs and ocean waves in a bed that was entirely my own, in a life that reflected my deepest values and wildest dreams. The woman who'd once believed she belonged in Derek's kitchen was now traveling the world, not as an escape from herself, but as a celebration of who she'd always been beneath the layers of compromise and diminishment. Lying in the darkness of my rainforest sanctuary, surrounded by the sounds of nocturnal life awakening, I whispered a prayer of gratitude to Abuela, whose final gift had been the permission to live without apology. She'd been right about everything. The world had needed my full flavor, not some watered-down version designed to please people who'd never been worthy of my gifts. And I'd finally learned to trust the only approval that truly mattered, my own. In the morning, I would begin planning my next adventure. But tonight, I was perfectly content to be exactly where I was, exactly who I'd become, living a life as vast and magnificent as I'd finally learned to dream. 2 more compelling stories are just a click away. If this one drew you in, wait until you see what else we found. Ready to explore?